the history of the exact origins of world religions is often shrouded in mystery, and the subject of much debate. The value holy books and texts have as historical documents has been a fierce academic battleground for historians for centuries. Islam, as the most recent global religion, was considered to be the exception to this rule, with the 19th century French scholar Ernest Renan claiming that it was born in the light of history. For centuries it was assumed that the Quran, Hadiths, Sirah, and other religious texts of Islam reflected the historical reality of the foundation and development of this religion. This persisted until 1970, when a movement spearheaded by the American historian John Wensborough began casting doubt on the historicity of Islam's religious texts, a movement which came to be known as the Revisionist School of Islamic Studies. This movement has questioned a vast array of commonly accepted things, ranging from Islam's place of origin to the historicity of the Prophet Muhammad. In this video, we will explore these alternative theories on the beginnings of Islam, reimagining our fundamental understanding of the origins of the Muslim faith, from its place of origin in the deserts of Arabia to the life and times of its founding prophet. This video is sponsored by our YouTube members and patrons, who get 2 exclusive videos weekly, not available anywhere else, for their kind support of our channel. You can join their ranks to watch more than 160 videos, including our series on the Pacific War, Punic Wars, Persian Wars, Spanish War of Succession, Russo-Japanese War, North African Campaign of World War II, History of Prussia, Italian Unification Wars, Risorgimento, Albigensian Crusades, and much more. Click the link in the description or pinned comment to get the exclusive videos, early access to all public videos, our schedule, wallpapers, access to a special Discord server where we're very active, and much more. Thanks for supporting us, we couldn't be doing it without your help. We have extensively covered the history and origins of Islam in our previous videos, particularly from the perspective which is now called the Traditionalist view. However, to properly contextualize the theories we will discuss today, we must first reiterate the Traditionalist historiographic view of Islam. According to Muslim holy texts, Islam was founded by its prophet Muhammad, a man from the Qurayshi clan of Arabia. The Islamic tradition says that Muhammad received his first divine revelation when he was 40 and started preaching a belief in the single God in the pagan city of Mecca. He was persecuted for this and was forced to emigrate together with his disciples to Medina. There, Muhammad managed to establish a Muslim community known as the Ummah and eventually returned to Mecca. Muhammad died in 632, and soon after his death, his successors standardized the Quran as we know it today. Muhammad was succeeded by the Rashidun Caliphate, the 4 successive caliphs chosen by the Muslim Ummah to lead the Muslim world. However, the legitimacy of this succession was challenged by Shia Muslims. In this period, the Muslim Caliphate significantly expanded its territory, an expansion which reached its apex during the Umayyad dynasty. The Umayyad dynasty brought an end to the Rashidun Caliphate when Muawiyah, the first Umayyad Caliph, transferred power to his son, essentially turning the Caliphate into a monarchy. According to the Traditionalist view, Islam had become a fully formed religion during the Prophet's lifetime and immediately after his death. According to Robert Hoyland, all the fundamental teachings of Islam had been established before Muhammad's death, and the source material tends to give the impression that Muhammad and his companions brought forth Islam complete, and that later scholars merely codified and interpreted it. As such, the Quran, the Sirah, or biography of Muhammad, and other interpretations of the religion, such as the Hadiths and later Muslim writers such as Al-Tabari, became accepted as the key sources for understanding the period of the foundation of Islam. For a long time, this narrative was commonly accepted by academia. However, in the 1970s, several scholars started questioning the historicity of the Islamic scripture, and in so doing, launched the Revisionist School of Islamic Study. While the views of revisionary scholars at times clash with each other, they are in agreement that the Quran, Sirah, and Hadiths should not be viewed as historical sources, but as literary sources, and as John Wensborough put it, salvation history. Indeed, revisionists believe that these Islamic texts, which were codified sometime after the life and death of the Prophet Muhammad, were heavily affected by the political reality and power dynamics of their respective periods. So what are the most commonly noted problems referred to by revisionist historians in Islamic sources? The main point of contention brought up by revisionists is the 150-year time gap between Muhammad's death and the first Islamic written sources about his life and the emergence of Islam. Indeed, there are no surviving written sources from before the second half of the 8th century describing the events that led to the foundation of Islam in detail. While external sources from the 7th century do mention the emergence of a new religion and a prophet. They do so only superficially. Another thing often pointed out by revisionists are the contradictions between Muslim accounts of the history of Islam and Muhammad's biographies. The same events or stories are described inconsistently. For instance, a prominent revisionist, Patricia Crone, notes that the Muslim sources present the same purported encounter of Muhammad with non-Muslims in 15 different ways. Another example is the story of Muhammad's soul being cleansed. The common theme here is that the Prophet's belly was opened by some beings who cleansed his soul from evil. The details of this story differ wildly between different Muslim sources, varying from the nature of the beings who did this, who ranged from angels to eagles, the number of people or beings who did this, and the number of people who witnessed this event. To be fair, it is rather strange that revisionist historians even analyze this story in the context of inconsistent reports, since it is clearly an example of hagiography and religious passage. Many would argue that this story is meant to be taken allegorically, not literally. So from a historical and academic point of view, it does not really matter that there are inconsistencies in this religious story. The third common problem that revisionists refer to is the impact of political power and dominant narratives on the early Muslim historians of Islam. This argument refutes the notion that the knowledge about Muhammad and the origins of Islam had been preserved. Revisionist historians mention the difference in the description of the jizya tax in Muslim sources as evidence of influence of the political dynamics of the age on these sources. The jizya is mentioned in Muslim sources as the tax that non-Muslim peoples of the book must pay to their Muslim rulers. However, in the earlier Constitution of Medina, a treaty between Muhammad and the elite of the city of Medina, including the Jewish community, there is no mention of the jizya. Moreover, the goalposts of who within the caliphate had to pay the jizya were periodically shifting. Initially, all converts to Islam were exempt from paying the jizya tax, but the increasing number of converts meant that the state was now getting less tax revenue, which obviously was not an ideal situation. Hence, the caliphate gradually started to sophisticate and complicate its taxation system in order to keep the state revenues flowing. Another revisionist historian, Jørgen Simonsen, mentions another example in his work. According to him, the term zakat, which is now associated with the obligation of Muslims to give to charity, originally meant purification in the Quran. It means this term was later reinterpreted in Muslim sources to legitimize the transfer of some social burden from the state to the ummah. It is beyond doubt that Islam's holy scripture and other religious texts have been interpreted and reinterpreted on many occasions, and this is occurring to this day. Muslim rulers, including the caliphs, have used religious authorities to reinterpret the verses of the Quran and hadiths. Some hadiths are universally rejected in the Islamic tradition for being fabricated for political purposes. However, it is not entirely clear how this argument of the revisionists poses problems to the traditionalist reading of Islamic history. The Quran is first and foremost a religious book, not a history book or a legal text. Many laws of the Islamic states have indeed taken their legitimacy from the Quran and Islam's other religious texts, eventually leading to the emergence of the Islamic law, the Sharia. With that said, the reinterpretation of Islam's religious texts in different and at times contradictory manners does not explicitly refute the traditional understanding of the history of Islam. Revisionist historians pose several other arguments in their critique of the traditionalist point of view, but what is their alternative reading of the history of Islam's emergence? Bear in mind that different historians propose different alternative understandings, and they are often not in agreement amongst themselves. Perhaps the most controversial theory posed by the Revisionist School of Islamic Studies was developed by Patricia Crone and her colleague Michael Cook, and puts into question the land in which Islam originated. While Muslims and traditionalist historians believe that the Arabian cities of Mecca and Medina were the places of origin of Islam, the aforementioned skeptics present a different methodology, relying on available foreign historical and linguistic data, along with archaeological evidence. The revisionists refuse to base their scholarship solely on Arabic sources, and on sources which make up the Islamic tradition, believing that non-Muslim sources who wrote about Islam during the time of the religion's founding provide a better understanding of the early history of Islam. In their work called the Hagerism, Crone and Cook argue that Islam originated as a Jewish messianic movement of Arab warriors and Palestinian Jews led by Muhammad. Their evidence for this comes from a Greek Christian source, the Doctrina Jacobi, which was written during the Arab conquest of Syria between 632 and 634. The Doctrina Jacobi talks about a false prophet appearing among the Saracens with sword and chariot. This source tells a story of a Byzantine commander being killed by the Saracens, and how Jews were overjoyed by this. Assuming this prophet was probably Muhammad, the Greek writer refers to this movement as the Hagarenes, descendants of Hagar, Abraham's wife, and Megaritai, or emigrants, a term strikingly similar to the Arabic term Muhajirun, which referred to the earliest Muslim community who emigrated from Mecca to Medina under the leadership of Muhammad. Crone and Cook argue that after a successful conquest of Palestine under the command of Muhammad, the Arabs gradually broke their alliance with the Jews in fear of being assimilated by them. Instead, they borrowed heavily from Christianity and Judaism to forge a separate religious identity for themselves, Islam. To that end, the Arabs accepted Jesus as the Messiah. They designated Muhammad as a figure similar to Moses, on the way to creating their own version of an Abrahamic religion. The authors claim that Islam gained its current form under the Umayyad dynasty, when the Arab control over the Holy Land was solidified and entrenched. Thus, Islam did not originate in Arabia, but in the Levant, several generations after the Prophet Muhammad's death. This theory is problematic for several reasons. First, it completely ignores Arab sources, and relies on foreign sources, ignoring the fact that non-Arab sources about Islam can be just as biased as Arab sources. Even though the Doctrina Iacobi mentions a false prophet, it does not specifically name Muhammad. The traditionalist approach argues that the Islamic conquest of the Levant took place under the first Caliph Abu Bakr and the military command of Khalid ibn al-Walid. So it is possible that contemporary Christian sources simply confused the commander of the army coming from Arabia with the prophet of a religion coming from Arabia. Third, Jews being happy about the killing of a Byzantine commander does not prove that early Muslims and Jews were allies. Perhaps this Byzantine commander was a common enemy. Perhaps, like many other Christian commanders in history, he oppressed Jews and they were pleased to see him killed by another group, which was unrelated to them. It is difficult to be sure, but it is clear that this narrative is based on meagre and incomplete evidence. Even John Wansborough, the founder of the Revisionist School, criticizes this work based on the selective use of hostile sources. Two other revisionist historians, Yehuda Nevo and Judith Corrin, came to a similar conclusion about the geography of the emergence of Islam based on archaeological evidence and non-Muslim sources. They argue that when the Arabs conquered the Levant, they were still pagans and became monotheistic after solidifying their rule there and coming into contact with the Christians and Jews who lived in the region. Only during the reign of Muawiyah did the Arab people solidify their control over the Levant, and only during the reign of Abd al-Malik did Islam as we know it emerge. They even go further to add that the proper name Muhammad did not represent a real person but an adjective, the praised one. This whole argument is based upon several inscriptions found around the River Jordan, and the lack of evidence in contemporary Christian sources about the important figures of Islamic history, like the Rashidun Caliphs or early Islamic era battles. Other scholars have refuted this ultra-revisionist position and dismissed it as a conspiracy theory, noting that traces of monuments and battlegrounds from the period of the emergence of Islam can in fact be seen in and around Mecca and throughout the Arabian Peninsula. Let us give you several relevant examples. There is an inscription from Wadi Qushayba, dated to 650 CE, which begins with "May Allah have mercy," suggesting that the Arabs who wrote it were not in fact still pagan at the time. Another inscription from the year 644 or 645 was found in Ka al-Mutadil, saying, "In the name of Allah, I, Zuhayr, wrote this at the time when Umar died, in the year 24. These inscriptions explicitly point to the deity the Arabs believed in, Allah, along with the second Caliph Umar. Along with that, historians like Robert Hoyland and Fred Donner point out that there are contemporary Christian sources from the 7th century talking about the early Rashidun Caliphs. Not only that, there are Chinese sources talking about them as well. All of this easily refutes Nevo and Corrin's theories. Ultimately, this theory relies on several small pieces of evidence on the way to creating a dubious story of the emergence of Islam, while ignoring plenty of contrary evidence that conflicts with its narrative. Another radical theory about the emergence of Islam outside of Arabia is proposed by the Inara school. They argue that Islam was actually founded by the Nestorian Christians who seceded from the church after rejecting the First Council of Ephesus in 431. Some of them were Arab Christians, and at one point in the 7th century, they ousted the Byzantine military from the Levant. According to the Inara school, at some point and for some reasons not precisely specified by the authors, these Nestorian Arab Christians decided to give up their Christian identity and create another Abrahamic religion, which by the end of the 7th century evolved into Islam. Similar to Nevo and Koren, the Nara school proponents doubted the historicity of the Prophet of Islam. They argued that Muhammad was not his own person, but a title, meaning the praised one, which was just another name for Jesus. This assertion is largely based on a coin from 660, with the word Muhammad containing a sign of a cross on it. Similar arguments used for the previous theory can be used to refute this radical revisionist theory as well. It is just another case of using disconnected evidence and ignoring the wealth of other evidence on the way to constructing a very elaborate theory. The next revisionist history we're going to discuss has been supported by historians like Moshe Sharon and Fred Donner. Both suggest that Islam did not emerge solely in Arabia. Instead, it was a collection of scattered and initially unconnected groups of believers in a single god. According to Sharon, after the death of Muhammad, different groups of believers emerged throughout the Middle East, including Eastern and Northern Arabia, Iraq, and Syria. Each group had its own leader, the Emir al-Mu'minin, or the commander of the believers, a common reference to the caliphs. This theory asserts that the group in Syria was led by the Umayyad family. In Kufa, Ali ibn Abi Talib was the leader, while in the Mecca-Medina region, Abd Allah ibn Zubayr was the commander of the believers. These groups competed and fought for power. Ultimately, the Umayyad dynasty won this power struggle and established Islam as the religion of their state to forge a unique religious identity. The proponents of this theory argue that at the initial stages, this movement of monotheistic believers, or mu'minin, did not have a distinct identity and prayed together with Christians. Donner notes that the word Muslim and its derivatives appear only 75 times in the Quran, while the word mu'min, meaning believer, occurs nearly 1,000 times. This, he argues, demonstrates that at the time when the Quran emerged, this new religious movement identified themselves not as Muslims but as believers. Donner claims that Quranic passages sympathetic to Christians and Jews, and historical reports of joint prayers demonstrate this. He argues that only during the reign of the 5th Umayyad Caliph, Abd al-Malik, did Muhammad become the central figure of Islam, and Islam gain a separate and unique identity from the other Abrahamic faiths. Revisionists claim that Abd al-Malik ordered the construction of the Dome of the Rock Mosque in Jerusalem to divert pilgrims from Mecca, which at the time was not ruled by the Umayyad. This is an interesting theory, but it suffers from a problem similar to other revisionist theories. Proponents of this theory cherry-pick evidence that suits their narratives, ignoring all the rest. There may be more mentions of believers than Muslims in the Quran, but Islam's holy scripture does mention Muslims, and this cannot be ignored. What if these terms were used interchangeably, meaning more or less the same thing, as is the case now? What if Abd al-Malik tried to divert pilgrims from Mecca to Jerusalem simply because he did not rule over Mecca? The Quran indeed does have passages lumping together Muslims, Christians, and Jews as people believing in the same God, but it also has many passages condemning non-Muslim monotheists for straying from the righteous path. All in all, the Revisionist School of Islamic study has been an interesting if controversial addition to the scholarship of Islam's history. There is one more video coming on this topic which will look at other alternative theories on the emergence of Islam. Make sure to check it out before you make your conclusion on whether you find the traditionalist or revisionist perspective more plausible. To ensure you don't miss it, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.